प्रेजेंटेड बाय ईबिक्स कैश। हर खुशी के लिए काफी है।
Welcome to Business Today. We have a very special guest on the show, Jim O'Neill, former chairman of Goldman Sachs, former UK Treasury Minister, notable global economist and chair of UK think tank Chatham House. Jim is the one who originally coined the acronym BRICS almost 20 years ago now to represent the emergence and rise of economies like Brazil, Russia, India and China, predicting that by the mid-2030s, the combined GDP of those countries would be as large as that of the G6. That's the G7 minus Canada. A lot to discuss with Jim post the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, the resulting impact on global governance, Biden's ambitious plans, China's emergence on the world stage, and what this means for shifting power dynamics. Jim, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
What's going to be the role, Jim, the ongoing role, so to say, of the US economy, and with it, or indeed separately, the role of the US dollar in the world economy and its financial system? The US has maintained such a massive influence throughout the past 50 years, despite the rise of other economies. Now that we've seen this massive event, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, Biden's evolving policy, very ambitious plans as well going forward in terms of stimulus, how do you see things changing?
I wish I knew the answer to all of these questions. I'd be sitting on my own very large Caribbean island if I did. I think I'll say two or three things to try and summarize it briefly. I think it's probably dangerous to give too much lasting importance about the Afghan mess to the role of the US and the dollar based on history. As I've written in a couple of pieces recently, both the Project Syndicate and the article, you could have easily said the same after Vietnam, you could have said the same after Iraq, Libya and so on, and none of them dented the role of the dollar in particular, which itself is peculiar given the rise of other economies and the relative, if not absolute, decline of the US economy. So I would caution viewers about that. Second thing to say, however, there are also some true long-term comparisons to be made with the sudden demise of the pound sterling. When I read history books, the pound still played a big role in global finance long after the relative decline of the UK economy. And that means probably at some very unpredictable point in the future, the dollar will cease to be as important as it is. And after that moment, historians will look back and say it was obvious. But when that's going to be, it's so hard to predict. And the third thing, therefore, it will probably depend on, of course, the ongoing performance of the US economy, but also, and here's a bit more of a subtle distinction, not only the performance of the Chinese and the EU and Eurozone, especially economy, but how their policymakers want to have their financial markets develop. When I look back over my whole career, and much of it has spanned the 50-year history of Bretton Woods, probably the reason why the dollar keeps going on and on and on with the same huge influence is because nobody else wants to provide some of that role. And until that changes, the dollar's going to have this not so economically justified important role hanging over the world of global finance, which of course is relevant to many places, including India.
Absolutely. It's an important point that you raised, that they have used it to pursue diplomatic objectives, security objectives. Yeah. Trump used secondary sanctions against countries that did business with Iran, for example. So future leaders of the US could continue to use it in a similar fashion. and perhaps even against countries doing business with a hostile Afghanistan. That could have a significant bearing as well. Tell us a little bit about the implications you see, particularly post the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Any reasons why perhaps this time it could be different? Could this work in the US favor as just described, based on history?
Yeah.
Or could we see it actually having, different implications?
So I suspect you might have, in your question, you hit on a key thought there. I don't know, but my suspicion is that the US has probably thought, hang on a second, if we continue to use the dollar and the US financial system in a more aggressive way against what they perceive as hostile states and countries that engage with them against our wishes, that is arguably more powerful and almost definitely less expensive for the US than these endless ground wars, which they never seem to emerge from victoriously, but with huge cost. And so I suspect that has been part of the thought process. And in that sense, it will be very important to see some evidence of that if countries do end up supporting the Taliban in Afghanistan in the way that America chooses to not desire. And of course, as I've already said, and I guess this is probably particularly relevant with China, but also to some degree in post-Merkel Germany, how the Chinese and the Europeans want to see both the RMB financial system and the Europeans want to see the euro used going forward. And, who knows, in 30 years' time, maybe the same question would be true about the role of India and the rupee. I think it's a bit early to be focusing on that today, but linked to the long-term BRICS projections, that could become a relevant question about India's role in the future.
Absolutely, and I totally plan on asking you that as well as coming to China and the EU. But just to sort of complete the thought or the sort of chain of thought on the US. In some of your recent articles, as you mentioned, you said it's better not to underestimate the US, but that Biden has taken huge risks with the US fiscal position, with the kind of stimulus that he's putting into play here. Do you feel that there is a potential risk downside if this fails, apart from tighter fiscal policy, if we actually see inflation fears turn into a reality? How big of a impact or negative impact could this have in turn on the global economy?
So I'm going to give you a contradictory answer because I think it's too early to judge. So it is the case through my career that to write the US off, which has been so tempting so many times, just think 20 years ago with 9/11, how easy it would have been, and it was a mistake. Same after 2008 and so many periods earlier. And so I think it's dangerous because the US has proved to be remarkably adaptable and flexible to a lot of things that happen. That said, as you say correctly, Biden has taken, against the background of an already weak fiscal position, some quite extraordinary fiscal risks. And there are two big risks that could accelerate the US's decline. One is that there is no, as economists would call, no multiplier effect, and this does not raise investments, and trend growth in the United States remains close to just above 2%. And that would mean it was, over the next few years, it would turn out to be a meaningless fiscal stimulus.
Right.
And then secondly, which is certainly more important for the near term, but maybe over the medium term, if it unleashes a period of a sustained pickup in inflation, it would by definition mean the end of the Federal Reserve Board's policy essentially going all the way back to 2007. And actually, if you really think about it, going all the way back to the early days of my career in the 1980s. Because the Fed would then have to think differently.
Wow.
And that would be a huge constraint for anything to do with the consumer in the US and at the moment for corporate borrowers who've obviously got quite a lot of leverage. So there are huge risks with the Biden program, but we'll have to see and watch closely, I would say, over the next 12 to 18 months to see what the evidence is. But it's too early for me, at least, to conclude at this stage.
Okay, so that's where we're at with the US. Let's move to post-German Europe, or the future of the EU post-Merkel, within that, the Eurozone.
Yeah.
And despite the size and the potential and the kind of influence it could potentially have, as you mentioned, we haven't seen some of these key global players really make a play to be that instrumental part of the global financial system. So some possibilities being raised here now of a future German government that may be more open to it. What do you see the chances of that happening? Do you feel perhaps now better than ever before there is perhaps a space for this? Whether they do or not is of course a big question.
Yes, well again, who knows? And time will tell. The German election opinion polls are even by recent standards remarkably volatile.
Yeah.
And as we speak, it now looks like the SPD, the left of centre government, could be the dominant player, whereas 5-6 weeks ago it looked like very likely to be a CDU and Green coalition. And so the first part of answering you is that is really important, obviously for Germany itself, but beyond. And I think the markets are starting to play on that a little bit, observing with a fine eye some of the relative pricing in the past few days. Because if we did get an SPD-led government, particularly where the Greens were part of a coalition, that does raise the possibility of a whole different approach to domestic fiscal policy in Germany. And if that were the case, it would almost definitely bring back the enthusiasts in the rest of Europe, particularly France and maybe now Draghi managed Italy, for a proper pan-European fiscal policy approach. And going to your core question and the core discussion we're having here, some kind of true pan-European bond, which would greatly grow the appeal of the euro as a genuine other alternative to the US and the US dollar. And so these are huge questions. And, again, I feel slightly contradicted in my mind, because there have been times, obviously starting with the introduction of the euro itself, where you might have thought Germany would shift its stance from this very, very cautious stance that goes back really because of their own experience of inflation in the post-war times and the intermediate war times. But I do think the possibility of it is now higher than any time in the past, partly because of the strength of feeling in France, and because with Draghi at least, Italy looks a bit different. And then thirdly, crucially, of course, the COVID experience Europe has had, like many other parts of the world, and the Europeans have had to undertake, in any case, a fiscal policy expansion that Germany would have never have dreamt of. So this is another hugely important unknown, but one that I and everybody else should be watching closely if you're interested in world affairs as well as financial markets.
There's also, of course, increased focus on the Eurozone post what's happening in Afghanistan and the kind of, spillover that we may see in terms of how countries react. What impact would a future, more powerful Eurozone have on a crisis in the region like we've seen in Afghanistan?
I mean, I think my immediate response to that is you would presumably have a much more cohesive and coordinated stance on migration, whereas the immediate fear in much of Europe, certainly my country, the UK, but also on the continent, is what on earth is going to happen to migrant flows as a result of the Afghan mess. And it's very much a scattergun approach, reflective of how much of Europe is sort of pretty divided on so many different issues, and there's no clear proper pan-European leadership. And I think with a different approach in general to Europe from Germany, that could change.
Okay. From the BRICS nations, it's really been India and China that have continued to grow. If we focus on those for a moment, China first, and there are expectations that China will be as large as the US, and let's say if not 2030, 2040. The question then is, as you also alluded to in the beginning of the conversation, what does China really want? Will it want to be bigger on the global scene? Will it want to influence the global financial system and also contribute towards it in a responsible manner? What do you feel? I mean, how do you see Chinese policy evolving? Do you feel it's headed in that direction? And if not, why not?
So here's a peculiar part of my answers to you, that historically, for me, predicting the next 5 years and beyond for China, I always found relatively straightforward, despite the uncertainties of these things, because I felt there was a great deal of clarity and steadiness about Chinese policy. And unlike many other international commentators, I've never feared the direction that China was going on would be different than the one that their ongoing 5-yearly assessments would indicate. At this moment in time, I see two dilemmas. One is which kind of relate to each other. One is the apparent crackdown that Xi is continuing to make, linked to this desire for more equality, itself raises risks about further disincentivizing parts of domestic economic growth, particularly on investment, because it discourages risk-taking by private individuals that might worry they're going to be penalized potentially savagely by the government, and with it also the consumer. And that raises risks to Chinese growth at a time, crucially, when their domestic labor force has almost definitely peaked. So the dynamics for growth in China going forward aren't as good as they've been in the past. And then secondly, and going to the core of your fascinating question, it's not clear to me that the Chinese have got a truly developed stance of how they want to engage with the rest of the world. I think you can see it with One Belt, One Road, which in many ways has been a huge disappointment. To take a sensitive but important area for your audience, it is noticeable for the complete lack of dialogue and involvement of India. And if China can't truly engage in a constructive way with important neighbors in the region, it shows how difficult it's going to be for China to be a bigger, accepted player in the same way the US has been globally the last 50 years. And China's got to figure all of these things out. And it's very difficult given the rules of engagement internally in China with a single party state. And I'm not quite sure how easy it is going to be for the Chinese leadership to resolve these issues, but I've come to the conclusion that in order for China to reach the position of the world's largest economy is not so difficult, but in order for them to reach it and have a bigger, stable relationship with the rest of the world, they've got to change aspects of how they engage with the rest of the world.
Okay. Biden towards China, that's interesting as well. US policy, how volatile it's been, and how detrimental this can be for the world economy if we see the US turning its attention from the Middle East now to China in an antagonizing manner as opposed to in a constructive manner. Whether it's economic or maybe a bit far-fetched right now to discuss military threats, but in the past we've seen economic collaboration between these two great nations, but the list of complaints against China currently just is growing, from technology theft to its policy on Hong Kong, Wuhan and the coronavirus. So is this a situation that looks like it's a pot boiler? I mean, the kind of gap in conversations that we've had post the pre-COVID era, where there were all these conversations on trade talks, post the worst of the pandemic for now, do we see constructive conversation? that would definitely be in everyone's interest, or do we see further room for strife between the two nations?
Well, it looks to me at the moment there is unfortunately the latter, that there's scope for further problems between the two countries. And I don't think that's stable either. I think the US is going to have to change.
Okay.
In my opinion, aspects of the US stance are rather naive, because it seems to be based on this idea that they want China to eventually become a democracy like the US and many other countries. And, I think it shows a lack of understanding of a lot of China's history. And of course, crucially, the implicit support that the Chinese government have from the Han population in China. I say naive because even though it's very different, the US should feel a bit more bruised about the experience it's had of trying to impose an American-style democracy in many other smaller places. And it's not worked in those. So I think all that part of the American approach is essentially a mistake. Obviously, there are very important values that the US leads and represents for many of the West of us from Western democracies, such as human rights and rules of law on trade. And China has got to somehow, this is partly what I meant earlier, China has to somehow find a way of behaving more, at least more consistently with what many of us are used to, or introduce a new, gentler way of why they do what they do, because it's very hard for many of the rest of us to understand. But I think because of China's importance, the US can't afford to persist on a permanently antagonistic stance, because it will end up hurting the US and the rest of the world. Because as you and I have discussed before, China's the most marginally important economic force in the world of the past 20 years. And if you disrupt it to the point of chaos, it's going to be bad for everybody.
Okay, that's important. And finally, Jim, India, where do we stand in this current mix of things? You alluded to China and Russia and how they're being perceived post the Afghanistan crisis. India, while currently seems to be, of course, riding high on a lot of inflow of foreign investor money at capital at the moment. How do you see its prospects over the next 20 years now? I'm saying 20 years because I know your initial paper talked about 2030. Yeah.
Well, I mean, in theory, India is now poised, given the demographics in other places, and India's still favorable ones. India is poised within the next 15 years to become the third largest economy in the world, overtaking Japan. And whether that happens or not greatly depends on what Indian policies are. Again, as we've discussed before, and I think is reasonably general wisdom outside of India these days, that the second term of Modi has been quite a disappointment compared to the hopes of early days. And India needs to somehow still undertake a number of rather basic reforms to unleash this demographic advantage in the same way China did 30 years ago. And if it did, it's still conceivable that India could grow by close to double digits over the next 15, 20 years. But without it, it's going to be influenced, as it has been the past few years, by global events. And India will experience much more erratic cycles of growth, vulnerable to global forces. And it doesn't need to be that way, given India's great potential and its enormous human resource. But it requires bolder decision-making in terms of genuine reforms to boost productivity, which, from what I can see, generally speaking so far, are not happening.
Well, Jim, that was an extremely detailed and comprehensive perspective on the current shifting global power dynamics, particularly in the context, of the overarching crisis in Afghanistan, and how that's really implicated change for so many of the global leading majors right now. Thanks so much for joining us. Always a pleasure speaking with you, and I look forward to chatting with you again to discuss how some of these things evolve. Thank you so much.
Well,